Welcome. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the people and land of the Rio Grande Valley, both historical and contemporary. This is a gesture of equity that I think is particularly appropriate given the topic of my presentation and this conference's theme. Indigenous land does not conveniently map onto current political projections, and modern-day people whose lands overlap the current Mexico-US borderlands are in especially precarious positions of being nations across nations. I would like to recognize and acknowledge the indigenous people of this land, especially the Coahuiltecan and Carrizo Comecrudo tribes, the latter of whom are still fighting to protect and preserve the National Butterfly Center in Mission, Texas, and all our threatened and endangered relations in the area from further harm. I'd also like to thank my collaborators on this project from the University of Texas Rio Grande Valley Writing Center and the American Sign Language Program in the Department of Communication, Science, and Disorders. Mapping a Borderland Writing Center. Writing centers articulate missions, enact praxis, and promote services through expected written academic discourses like educational resources, handouts, style guides, etc., classroom and online presentations, and web spaces, all of which convey to their audiences information about what the Writing Center is and what it does. These textual designs are not merely embellishments, but play an integral role in making text functions as socially situated discourse. Writing Centers identifications are likewise constructed through built-in natural environments, rhetorical spaces that account for geographical regions, locations on campuses, the physical centers themselves, and online spaces. Karen Barad referred to these material and discursive constraints as entangled in all their requisite refigurings of causality, materiality, agency, dynamics, and topological reconfigurations, and thus lacking an independent self-contained existence. In other words, we can't separate the meaning or being of the Writing Center from its discursive representations, its physical existence, its stakeholders, or the broader societal and economic conditions in which it operates. They all inform and create the other. This presentation, part of a larger project of Writing Center space, has three objectives. First, map the distance between two writing centers as a single institution, the pathways that stakeholders take on each campus, the interior designs of those spaces, and the proximities of those centers to locations of contemporary political exigence. Meanwhile, these nodes and networks are analyzed through a comprehensive framework that incorporates concepts of Borderlands La Frontera, depth space, entanglement, experiential landscapes, and articulation. Lastly, by way of provocation, the Borderlands Writing Center is theorized as a response to the effects of institutional hegemony in higher education, and the neoliberal academy in particular. Mapping, distribution, and connection. The first set of discursive artifacts I'm going to talk about today are maps depicting the paired locations of a writing center, technically one center, two locations, at a single Borderlands institution. I don't want to make too much yet of the Writing Center Borderlands analogy, but writing centers are like Borderlands in that they are proliferations, liminal spaces constructed and reinforced through writing, policy, and practice. In so doing, as writing centers write their spaces, they become part of their environments, producing themselves and their stakeholders. Mapping distribution. For a writing center on a distributed campus at a large, public, Hispanic-serving institution in a Mexico-US borderlands region, the ongoing concerns of the global pandemic, the civil rights movement, political instability, and environmental precarity take on added weight in terms of access to physical, linguistic, and academic resources. The map pictured here is a revised version of one of many produced by UTRGV, and it presents layers of information relevant to discursive formations of institutional identification. The map depicts the Rio Grande Valley, El Valle region of South Texas and the northeasternmost corner of the Mexican state of Tamaulipas. The silhouette of the state of Texas on the right-hand side of the map indicates, more or less, the region's location within the state, here marked by a gray star. The orange lines represent major interstate and international highways running through the region, connecting cities and people. Also worth noting, those colors, gray and orange, are intended to represent the institution and university system. The cities named on the map, going west to southeast, Rio Grande City, Edinburgh, McAllen, Westlaco, Harlingen, South Padre Island, and Brownsville mark UTRGV's main and satellite campuses while also invoking the colonial history of the region. Two of these locations, Edinburgh and Brownsville, are tagged with the words Writing Center in black typeface to indicate where the physical writing centers for this institution are located in proximity to the various campus sites. I've also tagged the McAllen site in purple typeface, although that is in reference to the writing center at the other four-year degree granting institution in the region. Maps such as this one are common discourses for institutions of higher education, which serve not only to inform stakeholders of where institutional resources can be accessed, but also to imply the institution's reach and engagement with the community. In this case, certain locations are articulated as belonging to the network of the institution, and perhaps as being sites of academic and economic significance. Related to neoliberal tautologies of institutional branding and marketization, distributed campus models are becoming increasingly common. However, this distributed model also invites constraints, as faculty, staff, and students are often required to physically travel to different locations in order to attend classes and meetings or to access resources. Mapping connection. This second map zooms in on the same geographic areas as the one before it, but includes information like municipality names and more streets. It also shows in greater detail the Rio Grande, indicated by a squiggly gray line that cuts left to right at about the bottom third of the map, the river that marks the international boundary. This map illustrates how mapping the writing centers is an act of articulation, which has to take into account the people involved as well as their material experiences. Highlighted on this map is the driving route from the writing center on the Edinburgh campus to the center in Brownsville. As indicated on the map, the two campuses are 65.6 miles apart, or a little over an hour's driving time for the shortest route. During a typical work week, writing center faculty and staff are required to be present on both campuses, and although tutors and students have designated home campuses, they occasionally attend workshops, classes, and the writing center on the other campus. Faculty and the few staff who receive travel funds may use them to reimburse for gas mileage. Otherwise, paying for travel between the campuses, like parking, is a cost burden on employees and students. The university does offer shuttle services connecting the Edinburgh and Brownsville campuses, which stops at the Harlingen campus on each trip. One-way trips are roughly 90 minutes long, and buses are Wi-Fi enabled, so it is common for faculty, staff, and students to queue up for buses and do some of their work on the long commute. Over the past year, the need for inter-campus travel has been somewhat lessened, but these conditions have only revealed the enhanced the inequities of technological infrastructure and mobility and health access. Spaces, pathways, and lightways. Next, I'm going to focus on two spatial concepts, pathways and lightways. These aren't the only framings we could consider. Interiors, exteriors, entryways are also viable, but I'm interested in the pairing of path and light because of what they reveal about preferred identity and ideology. Jennifer Clary Lemon called the complex understandings that are formed from objects, spaces, architecture, and affect experiential landscapes that disturb the bifurcation of inside-outside, opening these landscapes as connected in a network of place. So, as Borderlands La Frontera reveals that the land and the personal are political, and how entanglement shows that being and meaning are co-constitutive, experiential landscaping attunes us to how natural and built environments, and natural built environments, likewise function discursively. Similarly, death space can also be understood as a process of enactment, as the creation and modification of physical space so that it is accommodating and accessible. A load-bearing beam for this analysis, death space guidelines consist of architectural design elements that address the 5 major touch points between deaf experiences and the built environment: space and proximity, sensory reach, mobility and proximity, light and color, and finally, acoustics. Pathways. Here I'm using the term pathways to refer to the geographies stakeholders must navigate in order to access the writing center. These include driving commutes, as mentioned earlier, walkways, stairways, hallways, and elevators on campus, as well as the digital pathways, such as how many clicks a user must do before accessing services. The image on the top of this slide shows specific features of the built environment outside the building that houses the Edinburgh Writing Center. most noticeably the inclined sidewalk. There's a button and ID card reader to the right of the doorway that will open the door, though both features are blocked when the door opens. These doors lead into a foyer with 2 more sets of doors leading to separate sections of the building. These sets of doors do not have door buttons, however, and will only open automatically if the user opened the outside door with their ID card. Students and employees can enable their identification card to open doors by requesting that feature through Student Accessibility Services or Human Resources, meaning that full physical access to the building necessitates a pre-understanding of the bureaucratic functions of the institution, along with participation in the neoliberal logic that defines reasonable accommodations as the responsibility of the individual. Next, I want to draw your attention to the right-hand edge of the cement sidewalk, which almost bifurcates the image. Although it may be less obvious in the photo, there's a drop-off from the walkway to the dirt, which is a result of runoff water eroding the soil around the roots of the plants. The hedges are trimmed to overhang the walkway, providing a tactile alert for walkers and wheelchair users who may get too close to the edge. In each part of this example, automatic door buttons placed in inconvenient spots, an inclined walkway without plateau, non-indigenous plants that caused hazardous conditions, the environment was built for normalized conception of the end user, or according to aesthetic preferences, and then retrofitted for accessibility. Moving to the image at the bottom, we see an eponymous feature of our Borderlands Writing Center, proximity to the Mexico-US international border. This photo was taken from the parking lot of the Brownsville campus, the nearest student lot to the Writing Center. On the left is a green chain link fence. Beyond the fence is a slight hill, on the opposite side of which lies the Rio Grande. You may be able to make out the U.S. Border Patrol vehicle stationed at the vanishing point at the distant end of the fence. This is not the infamous border wall, but is noticeable to anyone arriving on campus. Before the fence was erected, students would enjoy time in between classes sitting on the hill overlooking the river. Now, the fence plus the presence of Border Patrol marks the space as contested, as exclusionary, and as potentially violent, articulating the space and the people on either side accordingly. In fact, the fence seems mainly to be a deterrent for students, as from a vantage on the opposite side of the river, you can't even see the fence, owing to the false peak effect caused by the hill. This complicates the articulation process, which normally expects individuals to reflect on one's responsibility to others as a result of one's location, to ask how connections and alliances can be created as a consequence of this articulation. Lightways. Light plays a special role in Barad's reconfiguration of entanglement, as it is not merely a tool but an object of inquiry. It is at once a physical object, as well as an apparatus that reveals and defines other physical and digital objects. Lightways is the concept we're developing to account for the various ways that light functions in writing center space. In the 2 images presented here, one from each writing center location, there are a number of comparable retrofits indicative of the contemporary moment. Notably, socially distanced tables with chairs on opposite ends and plexiglass stanchions to separate and ostensibly protect users. This extra spacing mandated by the institutional COVID-19 guidelines, coincidentally and hypothetically, could provide for more accessible navigability, particularly for those using mobility aids. The windows welcome sunlight into each center, and the sunlight obliges, stretches out, and reaches at angles that complement the interior design. From each 3rd floor perch, looking southward, one can see as far as one can see. The expanse of suburbia, or alternately craning one's neck, across the river and into neighboring Matamoros. The sunlight, along with the prescribed objects that mark the spaces as writing centers, computers, racks of handouts, bookshelves, anchor charts, contribute to refraction of light, casting shadows that make the room difficult to read for low vision folks and difficult to communicate in for speakers of American Sign Language and other sign languages. Lastly, sunlight, especially in South Texas, also brings heat. It's regularly above 90 degrees Fahrenheit March through October, and it's not uncommon for outdoor temperatures to reach up into the 110s during summer sessions. This leads to material consequences in the perpetual use of material resources, belying the natural environment and geographic location of the centers, flattening them as institutional space. The blinds tend to stay shut, the sunlight kept out, the room is reliant on and defined by the industrial glow of recessed lighting and the hum of central air conditioning. Our theoretical framework emphasizes these features as part of the broader networks writing centers operate in, rather than as discrete, discursive elements, reifying the role that writing centers play in constructing a preferred kind of student and employee, an entrepreneurial individual suited for participation in a neoliberal society. Mapping, political and industrial. Discursive constructions of physical space, whether talking about museum displays, landscaping, or maps, are modes of articulating ideological, political, and social power. Thinking of pathways, for instance, as sequentially experienced articulations of physical space, creates a sense of narrative based on mobility and proximity of who can travel and to where. Just as institutions align their identities with their geographical surroundings, they are likewise co-constituted proximal industries in politics. However, uncritical readings of border regional discourse reaffirm dominant power relationships, especially when we accept national, institutional, and corporate domains as we find them. Mapping the political. The next map shows the route from the UTRGV Edinburgh campus and its proximity to the Donna Rio Bravo International Bridge, which is adjacent to a prominent migrant detention center in Donna, Texas. This detention center is one that was recently in the national news as a site for an opportunistic photo shoot for Republican U.S. senators. Although UTRGV frequently identifies itself on its proximity to the border, it is less articulate on the issue of migration and detention, and conspicuously silent on the treatment of people in those nearby detention centers. Eric Camarillo found resonance in the Border Processing Center as an allegory for the institutional functions of writing centers, which, through reinforcing ways of writing and being steeped in racist and colonialist histories, decide who can and who cannot enter the university, that is, who does and does not belong. Mapping the industrial. The final map shows the proximity of the UTRGV Brownsville campus to the SpaceX launch facility. SpaceX is a private engineering and space exploration company that has generated significant public interest, including from programs and stakeholders at UTRGV. It is also a company on this borderland region that receives the most public funding. Returning to the idea of how institutions are co-constituted by their environs, initially pitched to the local communities as a venture that would bring jobs and economic bounty to the region, SpaceX has since extended its recruitment efforts to bring in workers from outside the valley and its influence to enforce policies of gentrification. The company has promised to donate money to local school districts, albeit still netting a profit considering the tax benefits the company has received. Similarly, it is nearly impossible to identify a comparable example where such efforts, under the guise of philosophy, did not result in the company dictating school budgets and curricula. This kind of entanglement of business, public, and academic interests predates the neoliberal era, but a direct line can be drawn to the efforts of moneyed conservative interests in the 1960s to fund economics departments at top-tier universities with the charge of developing theoretical justifications for their preconceived ideologies. Lastly, one cannot discuss SpaceX's influence on the borderland region without considering its impact on the natural environment. Constructing the facility required the uprooting of acres of native plants, including those evolved to maintain the integrity of the coastline. Animals, especially migrating and local birds, which themselves contribute to a uniquely entangled identity and economy in the region, are displaced from nesting sites and frequently killed. Debris from exploded rockets frequently land in the ocean and the neighboring yards of long-term residents who take to social media to document these impacts, as well as the noticeable noise and light pollution. Provocations. Thank you for attending my presentation. I welcome your questions, comments, and critiques of my project. To facilitate that discussion, here are some parting thoughts by way of provocation. Gloria Anzaldúa asserted that borderlands are physically present wherever two or more cultures edge each other, where people of different races occupy the same territory, where under, lower, middle, and upper classes touch, where the space between two individuals shrinks with intimacy. Yet Borderlands La Frontera is a theory generated from, and thus related to, a specific region. What indigenous, anti-racist, decolonial concepts have been developed around and would be contextually relevant to the context of your writing centers? The manipulation of a physical environment is only a matter of accessibility, it's also a matter of mattering, in the case examined here of cultural and individual ontology and epistemology. Deaf space architectural concepts and discursive actions like conversation circles are also fundamental acts of making meaning happen in social, spatial, and material ways. How does your writing center make meaning? How does it include and exclude identities? And what political identities and ideologies are articulated through its physical designs? What are the business entanglements of your writing centers? Formal sponsorships, branded software, proximity to privately owned food vendors, and how do they contribute to co-constituted identities? How is accessibility retrofitted in response to identity? What are you doing in response to any of these things? And what embodiments are represented in those responses? Thanks again. Along with this recorded presentation, I've included the full transcript and reference list.